When a millionaire meets a homeless artist, their worlds collide in a park filled with unspoken stories. What starts as a simple gesture of kindness soon unravels into a journey of trust, resilience, and second chances. Before we begin the story, comment below what the city you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone! The midday sun filtered through the trees in the bustling city park, casting soft shadows over a scene of urban vibrancy. Food trucks lined the pathways, their aromatic offerings drawing crowds of office workers, tourists, and families. Among them was Steve Graham, a sharp-suited young tech millionaire. He wasn't there for the food or the crowd. He sought solitude, a brief reprieve from the boardrooms and balance sheets. Carrying a sandwich and coffee from a nearby vendor, Steve strolled towards his usual bench near the fountain. He paused, noticing someone had already claimed it, a young woman, disheveled, but striking in her presence. Her clothes were patched and worn, her auburn hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She sat cross-legged, carefully breaking apart a piece of bread to share with a scruffy stray dog at her feet. Steve hesitated, his curiosity piqued. He watched as she laughed softly, speaking to the dog as if it could answer her. Her voice was light, but tinged with exhaustion, a strange mix that tugged at something within him. "That's not much of a lunch," Steve said, stepping closer. The girl looked up sharply, her green eyes narrowing. "I don't remember asking for food critics today," she snapped, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Steve couldn't help but chuckle. "Fair point," he said, holding up his sandwich. "Here, take this." Her gaze flicked to the sandwich and back to him, suspicion mingling with hunger in her eyes. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Steve replied. "You just look like you could use it more than I can." The dog wagged his tail enthusiastically, as if urging her to accept. She hesitated, her pride battling her hunger. Finally, she reached out, snatching the sandwich from his hand. "Fine," she muttered, "but don't think this makes us friends." Steve grinned, sitting down on the edge of the fountain. "Noted." She unwrapped the sandwich, taking a cautious bite. Her weariness began to melt as the flavors hit her tongue, though she masked it with a begrudging expression. The dog sat patiently by her side, rewarded with a small piece of bread. "So," Steve said after a moment, "are you always this friendly, or is it just my lucky day?" She arched an eyebrow. "Says the guy offering sandwiches to strangers in the park. What's your deal anyways?" Steve laughed again, genuinely amused. "Let's call it curiosity. You don't exactly blend in with the crowd." "Thanks for pointing that out," she said dryly, brushing crumbs from her lap. "I'll be sure to buy a power suit next time I hit the thrift store." Steve leaned back, still smiling. "You've got a quick wit. I like that." The girl didn't respond immediately, her focus shifting to the dog, who nuzzled her hand affectionately. For a moment, a flicker of vulnerability crossed her face, quickly masked by her usual guarded demeanor. "I'm Grace," she said finally, not meeting his eyes. "Steve," he replied. "Nice to meet you, Grace." "Sure," she said with a shrug, finishing the sandwich and crumpling the wrapper in her hand. "Thanks for the food, or whatever." Steve stood, dusting off his pants. "You're welcome. And Grace?" She looked up, her expression a mixture of curiosity and weariness. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said with a grin before turning and walking away. Grace stared after him, her lips parting as if she could call him back, but the words never came. Instead, she took her head, muttering under her breath, "What a weirdo." The dog barked, wagging its tail as if in agreement. Grace gave the animal a small smile, scratching behind its ears. Still, her thoughts lingered on Steve, his easy demeanor, his sharp suit that hinted at a life far more removed than hers, and the way he seemed genuinely interested in her despite her rough edges. As she leaned back against the bench, the late afternoon sun warming her face, Grace allowed herself a rare moment of contentment, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Steve's sudden appearance in her life might lead to something far more complicated than a free sandwich. The next day, the city park buzzed with its usual lunchtime crowd. Steve rolled in, a brown paper bag in one hand and his coffee in the other. His gaze instinctively found Grace on the same bench, her dog Max curled at her feet. She was sketching something on a crumpled piece of paper with a stub of a pencil. "Back again?" Grace said, not looking up. "Didn't want you to go hungry," Steve replied, holding out the paper bag. Grace hesitated before taking it. "You're persistent. And what's in it for you, exactly?" "Maybe I just enjoy the company," Steve said with a grin as he sat on the edge of the fountain nearby. Grace unwrapped the sandwich, giving him a sideways glance. "You really need better standards for company." "I think my standards are just fine." For the next day, their routine began to solidify. Steve would arrive with lunch and coffee, settling into easy banter with Grace while she shared the food with Max. Grace's sharp wit kept him on his toes, and her candidness was a refreshing change from the polished, guarded conversations he was used to having in his high-powered world. One day, Steve noticed Max shivering slightly in the crisp autumn air. Without a word, he handed her a neatly folded blanket from his bag. "What's this?" she asked, frowning. "For Max," he said simply. "Figured he might need it more than you do." Grace blinked, caught off guard. She draped the blanket over Max, who wagged his tail enthusiastically. "Thanks," she murmured. "For him." Steve shrugged, hiding the warmth spreading through his chest. "No problem." As the days turned into weeks, Grace began to open up little by little. She told Steve about her life before she ended up on the streets, her dreams of becoming an artist, the time she spent at art school, and the sudden financial collapse that forced her to drop out. "Life happens," she said, staring at her sketch of Max. "You think you got it all figured out, and then the rug gets pulled out from under you." "Have you tried getting back into art?" Steve asked. Grace scoffed. People don't exactly line up to hire someone who sleeps on a bench." Steve didn't press further, sensing the frustration behind her words. Instead, he steered the conversation to lighter topics, making her laugh with stories about work drama he fabricated to avoid revealing his true career. "So, what do you do exactly?" Grace asked one afternoon. "Office stuff," Steve said vaguely. "Paperwork, emails, the occasional meetings." "Sounds thrilling," Grace said dryly. "You'd be surprised," Steve replied with a grin. Their conversations became the highlight of Steve's day. He felt himself looking forward to their lunches more than any business deal or social engagement. Grace's raw honesty and resilience intrigued him, and her humor brightened his otherwise structured, high-stakes life. But Steve wasn't the only one who began to feel the pull of connection. Grace noticed the way Steve genuinely listened to her, how he never made her feel pitied or judged. Despite her reservations, she started to look forward to see him every day. Still, Grace couldn't help but wonder about his motives. One day, as they sat together on the bench, Grace finished her sandwich and turned to him, her expression serious. "Why do you keep coming here?" she asked. Steve raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "You've got a job, a life. You're clearly not struggling like the rest of us. So why? Why waste your time with me?" Steve hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He could feel her eyes searching his face, waiting for an answer. "Maybe I like it here," he said finally. "Maybe I like talking to you." Grace frowned, but her gaze softened. She didn't press further, though the question lingered in her mind. As Steve watched her pet Max unfold the blanket over her lap, he realized the truth. This wasn't just about curiosity or kindness anymore. Grace had become a part of his world in a way he hadn't expected, and he wasn't ready to let that go. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. Rain fell steadily, drumming against the rooftops of parked cars and splashing into the puddles forming on the cracked pavement. Steve hurried through the downpour with 2 streaming cups of coffee in hand, his coat shielding the paper bag holding their usual lunch. Grace sat huddled under the thin awning of the park bench, her makeshift shelter doing little to keep her dry. Max, ever faithful, lay at her feet, damp but wagging his teeth at the sight of Steve approaching. "Rain or shine, huh?" Steve said, offering her a cup. Grace accepted it with a raised eyebrow. You're persistent. I'll give you that. Most people would have stayed home. Most people don't have a lunch date, Steve quipped. She laughed softly, cupping her hands around the warm coffee. Well, lucky for you. I'm not picky company. Steve glanced at the relentless rain. We're not sitting here in this, though. My car is right there. Less wet, more warm. Max can come too. Grace hesitated, her usual caution surfacing. Your car? Steve gestured to the sleek black sedan parked nearby. Don't worry, no tricks. Just thought it'd be nicer than freezing out here. After a moment's pause, Grace nodded. All right, but if you play elevator music, I'm out. Steve chuckled, leading her and Max to the car. Once inside, Grace leaned back in the passenger seat, visibly relaxed as the warmth seeped in. Max jumped into the back, curling up contentedly. You know, Grace began, holding her coffee cup, I used to love days like this. I would sit by the window and draw all day. So many drawings left behind in cafes, libraries, even in the park. Do you still draw? Steve asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Not much anymore, she admitted. It's hard to draw when you don't even have a pencil. Steve frowned. Do you miss it? Grace replied softly, her eyes gazing out at the rain-streaked window. I used to dream of opening my own gallery. A small place, nothing fancy, just somewhere people could come and feel something when they looked at my work. That doesn't mean it's impossible, Steve said firmly. She turned to him, her expression a mix of skepticism and gratitude. You're an optimist. I'll give you that. Their conversation lingered in Steve's mind after the rain had stopped and they had gone their separate ways. That night, he made a decision. The next morning, Grace arrived at her bench to find a neatly wrapped package waiting for her. Inside was a brand new sketch pad, a set of pencils, and a small box of watercolors. A note was tucked inside. Every dream starts somewhere. A friend. Grace's breath caught as she ran her fingers over the pristine supplies. Max barked, sensing her excitement. She clutched the sketch pad to her chest, her heart full of gratitude. The next day, Steve found her immersed in her sketchbook, a spark of joy in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Looks like someone's been busy, he said, sitting down beside her. Grace smiled, holding up a half-finished sketch of Max. It's nothing special, but it feels good to draw again. It's more than special, Steve said, meaning every word. As they continued their conversation as usual, Steve's mother's assistant, Olivia, happened to pass by the park. She slowed her pace, noticing Steve sitting on a bench, engaged in an animated conversation with a woman who appeared less polished than those usually seen by his side. That afternoon, Steve's mother, Zoe, came to see him at his office. Steve? Olivia saw you at the park this morning. Who was that girl? Steve immediately became defensive. Just a friend, he said. A friend? Olivia told me she looked homeless. Steve frowned. And why does that matter? She's not the right person for you. Steve brushed off his mother's concern, but her words lingered in his mind. He couldn't ignore how the world might perceive his relationship with Grace. The next day, Grace picked up his distracted demeanor. Something on your mind? She asked, handing him half of her sandwich, a rare gesture from someone who didn't have much to share. Steve hesitated, caught between the comfort of their growing bond and the secret he was keeping. Are you hiding something from me? Grace pressed, her tone light but probing. Steve forced a smile. Me? Of course not. But Grace wasn't convinced. As she watched him avoid her gaze, doubt began to creep in. For the first time, she wondered if there was something more to Steve than he was letting on. The sun hung low in the sky as Grace sat on the park bench, sketching absently while Max lay at her feet. She had been feeling uneasy about Steve for days, suspecting there was more to him than he let on. That afternoon, her suspicions were confirmed in the worst way possible. Grace was gathering her things to leave when she overheard Steve's voice nearby. Curiosity piqued, She moved closer, staying hidden behind a tree. I'm just saying, Steve. Olivia's voice carried a sharp edge. Spending all this time with her? This homeless girl? It's risky. Steve sighed. Olivia, I didn't approach Grace as a project. I wasn't playing some game. I didn't want her to see me as a walking dollar sign. She's different. Genuine. Olivia's response was skeptical. But you've been lying by omission. She's bound to feel betrayed when the truth comes out. Grace's heart pounded as she backed away from the tree, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. She could barely process the string of betrayal. Later that evening, Steve arrived at the park with his usual easy smile, only to find Grace waiting for him, her expression cold. Grace? He started, but she cut him off. So, you're a millionaire, she said bluntly. Steve froze. Grace? I can explain. Don't bother, she snapped, her voice trembling. I heard you talking to assistant. All this time, you've been pretending to be someone you're not. Was I just some little charity case to make you feel better about your privileged life? No. Steve's voice rose in desperation. It wasn't like that. I didn't want my money to get in the way of knowing you, of knowing the real you. Grace let out a bitter laugh. Oh, so you mean the real me? The one you decided to observe like some social experiment? Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? It was never a charity, Steve insisted. I admired you, your strength, your resilience. I didn't want it to ruin that by bringing money into it. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed sharp. You think that makes it okay? You lied to me, Steve. You made me believe we were equals, but all along, you were hiding the truth. You don't understand what it's like to fight for every scrap, to wonder where your next meal is coming from. Steve took a hesitant step forward. Grace, I care about you. I was scared you'd walk away if you knew who I really was. And now I'm walking away because you weren't honest, Grace said, her voice breaking. Congratulations, Steve. You got what you were afraid of. She turned and strode away, Max trotting after her, leaving Steve standing alone in the park. For days, Steve returned to the bench, hoping to find Grace there, but the spot remained empty. The thought of losing her weighed heavily on him. The winter air was crisp as Grace trudged through the quiet streets, Max by her side. Life at the shelter was far from comfortable, but it was a step up from the cold park benches. She tried to focus on her art, sketching in the evenings to find some solace, yet thoughts of Steve lingered, his betrayal mixing with memories of his kindness. Unbeknownst to Grace, Steve had been working tirelessly to make things right. Through a friend at the shelter, he discovered Grace's location. Though relieved to know she was safe, he respected her need for space and resolved to show her how much he cared in a way that honored her talent and dreams. Steve spent countless hours retrieving Grace's abandoned sketchbooks from various places. With the help of professional curators, he turned her raw, unpolished work into a breathtaking collection beautifully displayed on the walls of a cozy gallery in the heart of the city. This grand gesture had taken weeks of preparation, and now the moment had finally arrived. One day, while wandering through the streets, she came across a billboard advertising a community art exhibition featuring many renowned artists she admired. Most notably, the exhibition had no restrictions on who could participate. Something inside her stirred. That weekend, Grace decided to go to the exhibition. As she stepped inside, she froze. Her sketches, every detail, every stroke, were carefully framed and displayed. The raw emotions she had poured into her art glowed under the soft lighting. Around her, visitors, including several renowned artists, marveled at the piece, whispering words like powerful and stunning. Tears filled her eyes as she approached one of her favorite sketches, a portrait of Max she had tossed aside weeks ago. Below it, a plaque read, "By Grace, a visionary of resilience." "Do you like it?" Steve's voice came from behind her. Grace turned slowly, her expression a mixture of disbelief and guarded hope. "What is this?" "It's you," Steve said, stepping closer. Your talent, your story. I wanted people to see the incredible artist I've gotten to know. Grace's voice wavered. You did all this for me? Steve nodded. I know I hurt you. I lied when I should have trusted you to see the real me. But everything I feel for you, it's real. I wanted to give you something that shows I believe in you, even if you can't forgive me. Grace looked around the gallery, her emotions swirling. I don't need grand gestures, Steve. I never did. I just needed honesty. I know, Steve said softly, and I'm sorry I failed you. But I want to spend every day proving I can be better. I believe in your art, Grace. I believe in you. Grace's walls began to crumble as she saw the sincerity in his eyes, but her voice remained steady. Trust isn't something you can fix with a gallery or $1 million apology. It takes time. I'll give you all the time you need, Steve promised. Max barked softly, as if encouraging Grace. She glanced at the dog, then back at Steve, her lips curving into a faint smile. You really collected all these? Grace asked, motioning to the walls. Steve nodded, his heart swelling with relief at her softening tone. Every one. I couldn't let them go to waste. They're too incredible. Grace shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. You're unbelievable. Just persistent, Steve said with a small laugh. And I'll keep proving myself, Grace, however long it takes. As the gallery buzzed with admiration for her work, Grace realized this was more than an apology. It was Steve showing her that he truly saw her. Not just the girl on the bench, but the artist, the dreamer, and the fighter. For the first time in months, Grace felt a glimmer of hope, not just in her art, but in the possibility of trusting Steve again. Steve's mother was also present at the exhibition, witnessing everything. She felt Grace's sincerity, resilience, and talent. In that moment, all her previous doubts faded away. The weeks that followed the gallery exhibition were a time of soul-searching for Grace. Steve had given her space as promised, but his words lingered in her mind. She thought about his sincerity, his regret, and the incredible effort he had made to lift her up without expecting anything in return. One crisp morning, Grace decided to take a leap of faith. She called Steve, her heart pounding as she waited for him to answer. Grace? His voice was cautious but hopeful. Hi, Steve, she said, exhaling. I've been thinking about everything. If you're still willing, I'd like to start over. As friends. I'd like nothing more, Steve said softly, a smile audible in his voice. From that moment, Steve and Grace rebuilt their bond layer by layer. Steve helped Grace turn the temporary art gallery into a permanent space, complete with a studio where she could create freely. He respected her independence, letting her take the lead while providing support when she needed it. Grace began to see Steve's wealth not as a source of intimidation, but as a means of creating positive change. She watched as he funded company programs, offered job opportunities to those in need, and supported local artists, all inspired by her story. Meanwhile, Grace found her confidence growing. Her artwork gained recognition, and her gallery became a beloved space for people of all walks of life. The once homeless girl now stood as a symbol of resilience and hope. Months later, on the evening of the gallery's grand opening, Grace stood in the middle of a packed room, surrounded by friends, supporters, and admirers of her work. Max sat faithfully by her side, his tail wagging as Steve stepped onto the small stage set up at the center of the gallery. Steve took the microphone, his gaze fixed on Grace. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here to celebrate this incredible woman and her amazing talent. But tonight isn't just about art. It's about the person behind it. Grace felt her cheeks flush as Steve continued. Grace, you taught me something I didn't know I was missing. You showed me that life isn't what you have. It's about who you share it with. You give me hope, joy, and love, and I can't imagine my life without you. He stepped off the stage, pulling a small box from his pocket as he knelt before her. The room fell silent. Grace, Steve said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, will you marry me? Grace blinked back tears, her heart racing. Only if you promise to keep buying me lunch, she teased, a wide smile breaking through her tears. The room erupted in laughter and applause as Grace pulled Steve to his feet and embraced him. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling. 1,000 times yes. Their wedding, held months later, was a beautiful blend of two worlds. Max trotted down the aisle as the honorary ring bearer, earning a round of cheers and laughter. As the evening wore on, Grace and Steve shared their first dance under a canopy of twinkling lights. Grace rested her head against Steve's chest, her voice soft as she said, "You didn't just change my life, Steve. You showed me how to believe in myself again." Steve held her close, his voice filled with love. "And you reminded me what it means to truly live." As the music played and their loved ones surrounded them, Grace and Steve knew they had found something money could never buy. A partnership built on trust, resilience, and unwavering love. Thank you for joining us on this heartwarming journey of love, resilience, and second chances. Grace and Steve's story reminds us that true wealth lies not in the material possessions, but in the kindness, trust, and love we share with others. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. For more stories that stir your soul and remind you of life's unexpected beauty, hit the subscribe. We can't wait to share more incredible tales with you. Until next time, take care and keep believing in the magic of love and kindness.